I am Dennis Tubbergen. You are listening to the Retirement Lifestyle Advocates radio program. Glad you decided to tune in today. Hey, joining me on today's program in the second and third segments will be returning guest Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Many of you who are longtime listeners will recognize Jeffrey as a prolific author. And we're going to get Jeffrey's take on what's going on today as far as liberty and as far as central banking policy is concerned. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. Hey, if you haven't yet gotten the special report for April, we're carrying that over one more week. Today will be the last day that you can order this report by visiting requestyourreport.com. The April 2022 special report is titled Negotiating the Quadruple Threat, Devaluing Dollar, Sinking Stocks, Bubbling Bonds, and Climbing Commodities, Strategies for a Crazy World. So when you order the report by visiting requestyourreport.com, I'll be glad to send you not only the report, but also some bonus information as well that I think you'll find to be especially timely. And again, to request your report and the bonus information, this is the last day this will be offered. Visit requestyourreport.com. You know, a lot is going on around the world geopolitically. The focus of this program, of course, is to take a look at what's going on and how it might affect you and your retirement. And on today's program, I want to talk to you about something that I'm not hearing from many other sources. But it's something that I think is extremely important for you to be aware of and to consider. And I want to give you just a little bit of background information in this segment that I think you'll find helpful. Back in 2011, I wrote a book called Economic Consequences, and in that book, I talked about the fact that the Federal Reserve had embarked on this temporary program of quantitative easing. Put another way, the Federal Reserve had started down the road of creating currency. Of course, at the time, the then chair of the Fed, Mr. Ben Bernanke, told us it was temporary. I said at the time that it was a slippery slope and it would likely continue and it would accelerate the move to stage 4 in what I call the money currency cycle. And here's what that means and here's why that's important for you to know. In that book, I did some research and refined that research in the new retirement rules book. That was released in 2014 and then again an updated version in 2016. We talked about this money currency cycle. And this money currency cycle has 4 stages. And as we move through the stages, eventually we move back around and get back to stage 1 again. So let me just briefly review these stages with you. Stage 1, money and currency are the same thing. Now, many people, when talking about money and currency, use those two terms synonymously. They use them interchangeably. But that's really not the way those terms should be used. Currency, I define as the exchange medium used in commerce. Currency is what you use when you buy things, or currency is what you receive when you sell things. On the other hand, I would define money as a good store of wealth over time. Now, today's Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, was actually formed back in 1913. And prior to that time, a 1-ounce gold coin circulated as currency, and a 1-ounce gold coin was a $20 gold piece. Many of you may be shocked to find out that really the price of an ounce of gold hadn't changed much from 1792 when the Mint Act was passed all the way through 1913. So this 1-ounce gold piece was currency, but it was also money. While the 1-ounce coin had $20 in purchasing power in 1913, today that same 1-ounce gold piece has more than $2,000 in purchasing power. Now, stage 2 has paper receipts circulating as currency, but these paper receipts can be redeemed for the real money. These paper receipts are simply a claim check allowing you to go back and claim the real money. Now, shortly after the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913, the backing of the U.S. dollar by gold was reduced from 100% backed by gold to 40% backed by gold, and the Federal Reserve began to issue something called a Federal Reserve note. Now, the Federal Reserve note issued shortly after the Fed was established. If you go back and look at a 1914 $20 Federal Reserve note, it's got a picture of President Grover Cleveland on it. And on the bottom of the note, it says, "Will pay to the bearer on demand $20. So if you happen to have one of these Federal Reserve notes, you could present the note and get the real $20, which was the 1 ounce of gold. Now, this system existed really from 1913 all the way through 1971 in one form or another. Then we enter stage 3 of this money currency cycle. At that point, paper receipts can no longer be redeemed for the real money. At this point, the currency is a fiat currency backed only by the full faith and credit of the issuer. Once a currency becomes a fiat currency, history tells us it's only a matter of time before the ruling class overspends and then funds that overspending through currency creation. Excessive currency creation leads to inflation and then ultimately a fiat currency failure, or at the very least, a redefinition of the fiat currency. Stage 4 is that currency failure or that redefinition. At that point, history teaches us that the money currency cycle goes back to the first stage, and currency and money become the same thing again. Now, it's important to note when you study history that it can take 60 to 100 years for this cycle to complete. But here we are, in my view, nearing the end of this money currency cycle. Now, I'm going to talk more about this in the fourth segment of today's program, but the Cradle, and the Cradle is an independent news organization with a number of columnists, and there is a Brazilian journalist by the name of Pepe Escobar, who is a Eurasian specialist. In fact, he writes a column called The Roving Eye for the Asian Times, and he also did an interview with a Russian economist by the name of Sergei Glazchev. Sergei Glazchev, I believe, is the way the name is pronounced. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with what is going on now in the world now with that background that I've given you, we are now, I believe, moving to a redefinition of many currencies. Now, Mr. Escobar asked Mr. Glazchev this question, quote, "You are at the forefront of a game-changing geoeconomic development, the design of a new monetary or financial system via an association between the Eurasian Economic Union and China, bypassing the U.S. dollar with a draft soon to be concluded. Could you possibly advance some of the features of this system, which seems to be a clear alternative to the Washington consensus and very close to the necessities of the global South?" So this is public now that you've got the Eurasian Economic Union and China. Russia is a part of the Eurasian Economic Union now, putting together an alternative monetary system. Now, Glazchev said this, and obviously he is poking a bit at the United States. He said this, "In a bout of Russophobic hysteria, the ruling elite of the United States played its last trump ace in the hybrid war against Russia, having frozen Russian foreign exchange reserves and custody accounts of Western central banks. Financial regulators of the U.S., the EU, and the UK undermined the status of the dollar, euro, and pound as global reserve currencies. This step sharply accelerated the ongoing dismantling of the dollar-based economic world order." Now, Mr. Glazchev said that for over a decade, he and his colleagues at the Astana Economic Forum have been working on this system. So what is this system? Well, Mr. Glazchev says that it is a new synthetic trading currency based on an index of currencies of participating countries, and it would also be backed by 20 exchange-traded commodities. So it would be a system whereby all currencies were part of this basket of currencies, and these currencies were all backed by tangible assets like commodities. Now that is pretty big news, probably as big as when Richard Nixon eliminated the link between the dollar and gold. And about the same time as we reported here on this program, the Russian central bank now has pegged the ruble to gold. It's a moving peg, but at this point, the ruble is redeemable for gold at a rate of 5,000 rubles per gram. So we have this move from stage 3 and 4 back towards stage 1. Now, it's important to understand that these moves don't happen with clear, defined edges. There's often a lot of gray area, and I happen to believe we're in that gray area right now. And the reason I bring this up is that if you're listening to this program today and you are someone who has saved money in a 401k or an IRA and you aspire to a comfortable, stress-free retirement, if you're not taking into account as part of your planning this big evolution, this big potential evolution, perhaps I should say, in the way currencies operate, you really need to. And to that end, I would invite you to get the information we're offering on today's program. The special report is Negotiating the Quadruple Threat, Devaluing Dollars, Sinking Stocks, Bubbling Bonds, and Climbing Commodities, Strategies for a Crazy World. You get the report, as well as some bonus information. Just visit requestyourreport.com. I'll be back after these words with my special guest, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Welcome back to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Joining me once again on today's program is returning guest, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Many of you recognize Jeffrey as a prolific author and commentator. He is also the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute. I'd encourage you to check out their website at brownstone.org. And Jeffrey, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, it's always good to be here, Dennis. Thank you for having me.
So, Jeffrey, before we jump in and talk a little economics and Fed policy, why don't you let the listeners know what motivated you to found the Brownstone Institute and what you're all about?
I was disappointed after the lockdowns happened that there wasn't more of public moral outrage and also not enough serious examinations of the science behind lockdowns, which, from my observations, had no scientific basis whatsoever. We knew for sure that there would be immense damage to people's lives, to children's educations, to public health, to business enterprise, small business, to workers. I mean, we knew this. We knew for sure that it stood in violation of things like the freedom of religion when they shut our churches and commercial ethos when they closed our businesses and normal rules of civilized living when they quarantined us crossing states from one border to the next. People were actually afraid to drive for a while. Anyway, I was disappointed that we didn't seem to have an information infrastructure in this country to get the word out in a way that would have rallied people against these orders. And so after a year of this, I thought, this is the moment of our lives. This is our World War I. This is our Civil War. This is it. This is the War of the Roses, or however way you want to analogize this going back. And it's going to affect the world for the next 10 years, if not longer. And we needed some dedicated researchers and writers to get the truth out about this. And I have had a long experience in digital media and in website design and creation and editorial affairs. And I thought, well, I'm the one to do it. So I put it together. We opened the doors August 1 of the website in 2021. And in that time, I don't know what our page views are up to. I've stopped looking, but it could be 30 million, plus add another zero to that after you consider all the reprints on Epoch Times, the Zero Hedge, and you name it, all over the place. And so I'm just, it's speaking to the issues of the day. And, we've been cited in dozens of court filings, and, it's just made a big difference. We, the attention we've been getting is, given our size, is actually quite remarkable, but that's mainly because we try to be very strict about the science and try to connect things for people. This is a big problem, Dennis. It's I think a little bit hard for people to draw the cause and effect between things. What's the relationship between the lockdowns, the spending, the inflation, the war, the supply chain snags, the depression among children. All of these things are related to the compulsion and coercion that we experienced on an unprecedented level starting 2 years ago. And I wanted to draw that connection. So that's what we do every day. We try to document what's happening and draw the relationship and hopefully develop help public opinion pressure our political leaders to never do it again, and then somehow make the necessary reforms to make sure that it never happens again.
Well, congratulations on your success, and just to maybe continue along that line, certainly the massive quantitative easing, or we can call it what it is, currency creation in response to the whole COVID situation has certainly contributed to inflation. Also, there's significant supply chain interruptions. So give me your take on the primary cause of inflation and where do you see it going, and maybe just touch on how this is all related to maybe connect the dots for some listeners.
Yeah, as you suggest, there are myriad forces at work here. The supply chain breakages cause a reduction of supply, and therefore, according to normal economic laws, increase of prices. And, housing has its own issues here having to do with demographic upheaval and the search of money for a return and so on. But, I think it's important for people to realize something, that none of this would be happening nearly at the scale it is happening without the incredible policies that were pursued starting in the spring of 2020 and continuing really up to now, in which it goes like this. Basically, when you shut down an economy, the economy shuts down. Okay, so,
imagine that.
yeah. So that means an instant imposed depression. I mean, that goes without saying. Shut down, the economy is wrecked. Washington has this obsession with never wanting to see the data show anything real. So Congress made this catastrophic error within 2 weeks of the shutdown to approve the so-called CARES Act, which is something like $1.7 trillion in subsidies. Now, Dennis, why was this so bad? Well, it was bad because it allowed governments to avoid the consequences of their actions. So immediately, every state government in the country and every county, every city, and then tons of businesses and workers got flooded with cash from the federal government. Now, I've been around a while. You have to. We don't normally open up our bank accounts and find a check from the Treasury Department in it. That was a weird moment. And we're like, well, maybe the government's not so bad after all. So suddenly, the pressure to end the lockdowns went away. And it was like, well, this is kind of a good deal. If the government's going to continue to fund this stuff, let's just see how long we can keep this going. Well, they did, all the way up to, the numbers differ, but just like straight up COVID bailout money is something on the order of $6 trillion. Now how does, this is a little bit weird from a household point of view. if you are spending beyond your means, you're going to have to deal with the debt. But at some point, the bank's going to say, hey, you've got too much debt. We don't think you can service this. It doesn't match your income. It doesn't match your credit history. Congress doesn't face any of those limitations. They just can go. The only real limitation on them is the market for the debt might start to panic about the prospects of default. And that's where the Federal Reserve comes into play. So, suddenly Congress is dishing out all this, the big bucks, and all funding it with creation of new treasuries of various maturities. The Federal Reserve goes in and buys them all and ballooned its balance sheet far higher than it's ever been. I mean, it makes 2008 look like nothing. So how does the Fed do this? Well, there's a kind of a weird rule about central banks. Their checks don't bounce because they always cover them with newly created money. So if you look at the charts, and this is what I find utterly bizarre. Sometimes people think central banking monetary theory is complicated. Well, in this case, it was pretty simple. Congress spent the money, created the Fed bought the debt, and if you look at the monetary aggregates, like you don't have to look at the money base or anything complicated or the balance sheets or anything. Just look at M2. It's almost a dollar for dollar relationship between what Congress spent and the money that the Federal Reserve created. $6 trillion over 2 years. And unlike 2008, where, the Fed created a lot of money, but it dumped it into to shore up the balance sheets of the banking industry and kept it off the streets by paying banks. The Federal Reserve paid a higher rate to banks to hold that money in the vaults than they would otherwise get on the market. So the hot money never went out. Now, some people, and I was one of them, was predicting inflation back in 2008. It didn't happen because of this little trick, the paying a really nice interest on reserves. Well, this time was completely different. Instead of doing that, and by the way, this made, Dennis, as you know, the central bankers very cocky. They're like, wow, we can create a lot of money, and it doesn't seem to have any really bad macroeconomic effects. So this time came around, they said, all right, let's do it again. But this time, instead of putting it into the vaults of the Fed, they dropped it from helicopters all over the country.
Jeffrey, I'm going to have you leave it there because we're coming up at the end of the segment. But I would love to pick this up again in the next segment. My guest today, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker, founder and president of the Brownstone Institute. Go to brownstone.org and check out their work. I'd encourage you to do that as well. I will return after these words with Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Welcome back to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. I have the distinct pleasure of chatting once again today with Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. He's the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute. You can learn more at brownstone.org. Tremendous success the Brownstone Institute has enjoyed in the short time that it has been in existence. So, Jeffrey, we were talking prior to the break when the clock so rudely made me stop about helicopter money and how now this time around that the Fed created this currency, it got dropped on Main Street. So let me just ask you, what do we have to do moving ahead from a policy perspective to right the ship, or can it even be done?
Well, the public is very aware that inflation is running a lot higher than 8.5%. It's one of the things you notice from the way the CPI is calculated by the Department of Labor. They're doing it in an old-fashioned way. They have employees that go from store to store. So it's always behind the times. And we live in a digital age. So there's tools out there. One I've really come to trust is called Trueflation. I think the site is trueflation.com. And they measure prices based on real-time reports using APIs from, retail establishments and wholesalers all over the country. And they have clocked inflation running as high as 13.8 and food prices up, 25%. And that sounds a lot more realistic and consistent with what people are experiencing. So people are very angry about this. Now, the Fed faces a choice right now. And I'm not, I'm not sure if it's but anyway, this is what they believe their choice is. They can sell bonds and get their balance sheet fixed up, which has the effect of reducing the rate of increase, or even reducing, sort of sopping up a lot of excess liquidity that's out there. But that's a very dangerous strategy, because then it could kick the economy into recession, which we're already facing anyway. So, the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve is looking at this. There's two buttons on a dial. It's like continue the inflation or cause a recession. Which one are you going to press? And for now, it seems as if the Federal Reserve, even though they're inching up interest rates a little bit here and there, 50 basis points, I think, is the next schedule. It's nowhere near where it needs to be, and they're going to try to soft land the situation so we get, no recession and a reduction of inflation. I, Dennis, don't really believe that that's going to be possible. I don't see how that happens. If anything's possible, I suppose, but the logic of the situation doesn't point to that as a good solution. I think the only thing you can really do right now is come to terms with reality, start topping up this liquidity, bump up that interest rate, the federal funds rate dramatically. I mean, dramatically. We're not talking about 50 basis points, but you've got to have a normally shaped yield curve with interest rates that approach inflation levels in order to fix the situation, and that would immediately tank a lot of companies and cause tremendous problems around the country, which I don't welcome, you don't welcome, but that's the reality. We need to face this reality, and we're not facing the reality. And I don't believe that the Biden administration is going to do it, because here's the terrible thing, Dennis. Look, this is happening right before midterm elections. So tanking the economy into a recessionary state right now, even if it cools off inflation, is going to guarantee political losses at the federal level and all over the country. So this is what we're faced with right now.
Well, and Jeffrey, to jump in there, I mean, if we face this reality and follow the course of action that you've just suggested, doesn't that impose fiscal discipline on Washington, and that's something they're really not that interested in?
I think that Washington would panic, actually, under those conditions, and maybe pull back a little bit in the spending. I mean, these guys are dangerous, but they're not utterly and completely insane.
Well, that's a relief to know.
Yeah, and I do worry too. And you remember this? I think it was about 10 years ago. The U.S. there was talk about default, and that's the D word, right? I mean, that's a very dangerous thing for the market for U.S. debt all over the world. At the same time, Dennis, you're seeing real pressure on the status of the dollar as the international reserve currency. Now, the dollar is up relative to other currencies because, it's the least destroyed currency probably in the world. But with these international conflicts where they're going right now, and if you get an alliance between Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and Russia to move to a different currency, that could create absolute havoc. And so I think that prospect alone might cause some pullback in spending under those conditions.
Well, and Jeffrey, the scenario you just described seems to be, a reality in response to, the U.S., the EU, and the UK, freezing Russian assets. It seems that the move away from the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, at least in that part of the world and the BRICS countries, that all seems to be, accelerating at this point.
Yeah, well, I think the U.S. made a disastrous decision and effectively, how would you say, weaponizing the dollar and demonetizing the dollar in Russia. That was completely unnecessary. And what did they think was going to happen? Of course, you reduce the market for the dollar under those conditions. If the federal government can just say, I don't care how much dollar reserves you hold, or in this case with Russia, those were SDRs, the so-called special drawing rights with the IMF, that the U.S. pressured the IMF just not to recognize, to demonetize effectively the dollar for a major part of the world is going to have effects, profound effects on future perceptions of the stability of the dollar. Dennis, you and I talk all the time. I think one of the mistakes sometimes all of us make is to assume that governments, operate with some degree of foresight and intelligence. That appears not to be the case. It's weird to say that. It's very strange to say that, but sometimes I just think these institutions are so different from anything else that's in our lives. They're simultaneously sadistic and masochistic. Like they don't mind hurting us, and also they don't even know what's good for them. So that seems to be the moment in which we find ourselves.
So, Jeffrey, in the 4.5 minutes we have left, assuming we see this pullback in spending, assuming we see a more responsible course of action here, in your view, what does that do to the cause of liberty, which is something obviously near and dear to both of our hearts?
We're faced with really a situation without precedent in my lifetime, and it's a real struggle between the general demands of regular people to live their lives and be left alone. And I'm not talking about wild libertarian doctrine here. I'm just talking about a normal expectation that that we can keep our businesses open, go to church, travel, count on our money. It's going to be there. Just have basic stability in our lives on one hand. And then on the other hand, you've got this crazy administrative state that just believes that anything is possible and that there are no limits to their power. And we're really living in the midst of this. And this is kind of no better encapsulated than with the great struggle over the transportation mask mandate. The judge in Florida said this is dumb. You can't just tell everybody to wear a certain piece of clothing and call it public health. And I had assumed at that point that the Biden administration would say, oh, good point, and move on, especially when they saw videos of people all over the country, especially workers, for airports cheering. The TSA, stopped enforcing it. Well, sure enough, I was amazed with the Department of Justice. Well, the Biden administration said, well, we don't know what to do. Let's ask the Department of Justice. And I said, we don't know what to do. Let's ask the CDC. And the CDC said, uh-oh, now we got a problem. So they assigned some committee. And the CDC said, well, we have to protect, here's where it's interesting, we have to protect our authority. So they said the authority of public health. Now, keep in mind, they didn't say public health. They said the authority of public health. And so they kicked it back to the DOJ and said, you've got to appeal this decision. So that happened just last night. Now, that's just a completely remarkable and devastating thing. It reminds me a little bit, like, what happens now? Because every airline has announced the end of the mandate. What happens now is the Biden administration puts them back into place. I don't know. It reminds me of 1957 with Chairman Mao saying, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom. And then he used that occasion to ferret out all of his political enemies. So now the Biden administration will have videos of people celebrating the end of the mask mandate. And, are they going to use that for political retaliation? I don't know. So things are heating up very, very quickly. And these are going to be an interesting few months ahead of us.
Well, Jeffrey, we've got about a minute and a half left in this segment, so for someone who maybe wasn't with us at the beginning of the first segment, can you do about a 40-second commercial for what the Brownstone Institute does?
Yes, sir. So we're covering every area from economics to public health to issues of war and peace and everything, and all from the perspective of the dramatic reforms we need to make as a country and the world towards a more rational, more intelligent embrace of liberty for everyone. Liberty, equality, democracy, these kinds of things are really important. And they sound maybe like cliches, or maybe 2 years ago they sounded like cliches. Now we know they're not. They're the most important things we have, and they can be taken away at any time if these people so desire it. And we can't live like this. And that's what Brownstone is dedicated to investigating and looking at. And we're not going to let this moment pass. We face a real crisis, and we need institutions out there to stand up for what we've always believed in, which is limited government and freedom for ourselves, our families, our communities. So that's what Brownstone's about.
That's terrific. Well, my guest today has been Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. I will return after these words.
This is the Retirement Lifestyle Advocates radio program. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Glad you decided to listen in today. And thanks again to my special guest, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker, for joining me on today's program. If you're just joining me today, I do have an opportunity for you today. It's the last opportunity to get this special report we've been offering for the last month. The report is titled Negotiating the Quadruple Threat, Devaluing Dollars, Sinking Stocks, Bubbling Bonds, and Climbing Commodities, Strategies for a Crazy World. If you'd like to get the report as well as some bonus information that I know you'll find to be timely, all you need to do is visit the website, requestyourreport.com. The website, again, is requestyourreport.com. Just let me know where to mail the report as well as the bonus information, and I will be very glad to do that. In the first segment of today's program, I talked about the fact that in some of the books that I have done over the years, starting in 2011 with the book Economic Consequences, I put forth this idea that there's something that exists called the money currency cycle. And when you study history, it has existed many times throughout history without a doubt. And as I explained in the first segment, and we'll do again briefly in this segment, this money currency cycle has 4 stages. Stage 1 has money and currency being the same thing. Now, I define currency as the exchange medium. It's what you use to buy and sell things. And I define money as a good store of wealth over time. Now, prior to the establishment of the Federal Reserve back in 1913, which is the central bank of the United States, gold circulated as currency. In fact, a 1-ounce gold coin was worth $20. And you would use that 1-ounce gold coin in commerce. So it was currency, but it was also money. Because the $20 in purchasing power that gold piece had in 1913, today is now about $2,000 in purchasing power. So at this stage of the money currency cycle, gold was money and gold was currency. The second stage of the cycle took place shortly after the Federal Reserve was founded, and there was something called a Federal Reserve note, a paper note that looked a lot like the notes you have, the bills you have in your purse or wallet. This Federal Reserve note circulated, and on this note, the words were printed, "will pay to the bearer on demand." So if you had a $20 Federal Reserve note, it said, "will pay to the bearer on demand $20. You could exchange that Federal Reserve note for the actual money. Then we got to stage 3 of this money currency cycle. At that point, the redemption privilege is suspended. In this case, it was suspended permanently by Mr. Richard Nixon back in 1971, and since that time, the dollar has been a fiat currency. And history teaches us that once a currency becomes a fiat currency, it's only a matter of time before the ruling class overspends and then funds that overspending through currency creation. That's exactly what has happened. And now, because fiat currencies historically have a 100% failure rate, we are now looking for currency and money to be redefined. And that's actually happening now. We talked about the fact in the first segment that the U.S., the U.K., and the European Union froze assets of Russia as part of the sanctions that were issued. Now, that has caused Russia and other members of the Eurasian Economic Union and China to accelerate their move to develop an alternate currency system. Now, I talked about an interview that Brazilian freelance reporter Mr. Pepe Escobar did with Sergei Glazchev, and he is a Russian economist. And this is what Mr. Glazchev had to say to pick up where I left off. He said, currently the U.S. is fighting to maintain its dominance. Put another way, the U.S. is fighting to maintain its reserve currency status. Now, if all this seems a little bit foreign to you, a reserve currency is simply the currency that is most trusted in the world and is used in international trade. Well, Mr. Glazchev said that because of what the U.S. did, because of what the EU did, because of what the UK did, that they need to now transition to a new system to bypass the dollar because, one, they can't use them, and two, they feel like they can't trust them. And this is what he had to say. There's going to be 3 phases to this transition. He says in the first phase of this transition, countries fall back to using their national currencies and clearing mechanisms. At this point, price formation is still mostly driven by prices at various exchanges denominated in dollars. This phase is almost over. Mr. Glazchev says that after Russia's reserves in dollars, euro, pound, and yen were frozen, it's unlikely that any sovereign country will continue accumulating reserves in these currencies. Now, perhaps it's coincidence, perhaps it is not, but if you take a look at what U.S. Treasuries have done during the month of March, the long bond is down about 15%, and yields have gone from 2% to 3%. That's in a very short period of time, less than 2 months. So it seems that demand for U.S. Treasuries is down because U.S. Treasuries have lost 15% of their value in less than 2 months. Now, Mr. Glazchev said that the second phase of the transition will involve new pricing mechanisms that do not reference the dollar, and that's actually where they are at in this process. And then he says, finally in the process, we will, in the third and final stage, that there will be a new digital payment of currency that will be backed by physical assets like commodities. He said a currency like this can be issued by a pool of currency reserves of BRICS countries, which all interested countries will be able to join. Now, why do I bring this up on today's program? Well, one, I think it's important for everyone to know that currency and money do change over time. And if you're not having that conversation as part of your retirement income planning, let me just say that it's my strong opinion that you should be. And that's why I'm offering some free information on today's program. It's a last opportunity to get the report titled Negotiating the Quadruple Threat, Devaluing Dollars, Sinking Stocks, Bubbling Bonds, and Climbing Commodities, Strategies for a Crazy World. To get the report, all you need to do is visit the website, requestyourreport.com. The website, again, is requestyourreport.com. Give me your name and address, and we'll send you a free box of information, and I would encourage you to do that if you have not yet gotten this perspective. So again, requestyourreport.com is the website. That's my program for this week. Hope you got something you can use. I'll be back again next week.